83 years ago, during a reconnaissance mission over Iwo Jima, Lieutenant Richard Best disappeared without leaving a trace. His absence plunged his family into tragedy and silent mourning, while his squadron mates and the military community remained baffled by the mystery. Military archives suggested various hypotheses, but no conclusion was ever reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but his family never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. The morning of February 15, 1942, began like any other at Henderson Field. Lieutenant Richard Best, 26 years old and one of the Navy's most promising dive bomber pilots, walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward his aircraft. The SBD Dauntless, with its distinctive perforated dive brakes and rear-facing gunner position, had become the backbone of American naval aviation in the Pacific. Best had flown dozens of missions in his aircraft, tail number 2B3, and had developed an almost supernatural trust in both the machine and his rear gunner, radioman First Class James Murray. The briefing had been routine, almost mundane in its simplicity. Intelligence reports indicated minimal Japanese air presence over Iwo Jima, with most enemy fighters concentrated around the main airfield on the southern tip of the island. Best's Squadron VB6 was assigned to conduct photographic reconnaissance of the northern beaches and provide close air support for a submarine operating in the area. The mission was expected to last no more than 4 hours, with a planned return time of 1,400 hours. Commander Wade McCluskey, the squadron leader, had emphasized the importance of maintaining radio contact throughout the mission. The waters around Iwo Jima were known for unpredictable weather patterns, and several aircraft had been lost to sudden storms in recent weeks. Best acknowledged the briefing with his characteristic quiet confidence, the same demeanor that had earned him respect among both enlisted men and officers. His logbook showed over 300 combat hours, making him one of the most experienced pilots in the squadron. As the sun began to rise over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the flight deck, Best performed his final pre-flight inspection. He checked the aircraft's control surfaces, tested the radio equipment, and verified that the reconnaissance cameras were properly loaded and functioning. Murray, his radioman, conducted his own checks of the communication equipment and defensive armament. The two men had flown together for 8 months and had developed the kind of wordless coordination that kept aircrew alive in combat. At 09:45 hours, Best received clearance for takeoff. His wife, Margaret, back in San Diego, was probably getting their son, Tommy, ready for his morning walk to the park. She had no way of knowing that this routine mission would be the beginning of a mystery that would consume the rest of her life. Best's last recorded transmission was a simple acknowledgement of takeoff clearance, his voice calm and professional over the radio. The tower operator later recalled that there was nothing unusual in the lieutenant's tone, no hint of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The Dauntless lifted off the runway with its characteristic heavy rumble, climbing steadily into the morning sky. Within minutes, the aircraft had disappeared into the low-hanging clouds that shrouded the northern approaches to Iwo Jima. It was the last time anyone would see Lieutenant Richard Best alive, though it would be decades before his family learned the truth about his final moments over that desolate volcanic island. The first sign that something was wrong came at 14:30 hours, 30 minutes after Lieutenant Best's scheduled return. The control tower at Henderson Field had been monitoring radio frequencies throughout the morning, but no communication had been received from aircraft 2B3 since takeoff. Squadron Commander Wade McCluskey initially attributed the silence to radio difficulties, a common problem in the electromagnetic environment around volcanic islands. The ionospheric disturbances caused by Iwo Jima's geological activity were known to interfere with communication equipment, and several aircraft had experienced similar blackouts in recent weeks. By 1500 hours, however, McCluskey's concern had escalated to alarm. Standard operating procedure required all reconnaissance aircraft to maintain radio contact at 30-minute intervals, and Best was meticulous about following protocol. The lieutenant had never missed a scheduled check-in during his 8 months of combat operations, and his attention to detail had saved his life on multiple occasions. Something was terribly wrong, but the military bureaucracy was slow to respond to what might have been a simple equipment malfunction. The first search aircraft was launched at 15:45 hours, nearly 6 hours after Best's departure. A flight of 4 F-4F Wildcats swept the northern approaches to Iwo Jima, following the planned reconnaissance route that Best should have taken. The pilots reported clear skies over most of the search area, with visibility extending for miles in all directions. There was no sign of aircraft wreckage, no oil slicks on the water, no emergency rafts or debris that might indicate a crash. It was as if Lieutenant Best and his Dauntless had simply vanished into thin air. The search expanded over the following days, eventually involving 16 aircraft and 2 destroyers. Navy dive teams examined the shallow waters around Iwo Jima's northern beaches, while aerial reconnaissance photographed every square mile of ocean within a 50-mile radius of the island. The Japanese, monitored through intercepted radio communications, made no mention of shooting down American aircraft that day. Their own records, captured years later, would show no engagement with enemy bombers on February 15, 1942. Back in San Diego, Margaret Best waited by her telephone, counting the hours since her husband's last letter had promised he would call after his mission. The Navy's notification system was slow and inconsistent in 1942, and families often learned about casualties from newspaper reports before receiving official word. Margaret had developed a routine of listening to radio broadcasts every evening, dreading the moment when she might hear her husband's name among the missing or killed in action. The official notification came on February 20th, 5 days after Best's disappearance. A Navy chaplain and a base communications officer arrived at Margaret's small apartment near the San Diego Naval Base, their presence immediately conveying the gravity of the situation. Lieutenant Richard Best was listed as missing in action, presumed dead, following an aircraft accident during combat operations in the Pacific Theater. The notification included no details about the circumstances of his disappearance, no mention of search efforts, and no timeline for further investigation. Margaret's world collapsed in that moment, but the full magnitude of her loss would only become apparent in the years that followed. The Navy's casualty notification system treated missing in action cases as temporary administrative problems, subject to future review and possible resolution. Families were given hope that their loved ones might be found alive, captured by the enemy, or stranded on remote islands. That hope, well-intentioned but ultimately cruel, would keep Margaret Best trapped in limbo for the rest of her life, unable to grieve properly or move forward with any certainty about her husband's fate. The weeks following Lieutenant Best's disappearance revealed the harsh realities of military bureaucracy during wartime. Margaret Best, thrust into the nightmare of official uncertainty, discovered that the United States Navy had no standardized procedure for handling missing-in-action cases in the Pacific Theater. Each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident, with minimal coordination between search efforts, intelligence gathering, and family notification. The military's primary focus was maintaining operational readiness, not providing closure to grieving families. Margaret's first attempt to gather information about her husband's mission came through a letter to Commander McCluskey, dated March 3, 1942. Her handwriting, preserved in Navy archives, shows the careful penmanship of a woman trying to maintain composure while her world fell apart. She asked simple questions that should have had simple answers. What was the nature of Richard's mission? Had any wreckage been found? Were there plans for continued search efforts? McCluskey's response, when it finally came 6 weeks later, was a masterpiece of military evasion that revealed nothing while appearing to be helpful. The commander explained that Lieutenant Best had been conducting routine reconnaissance operations when his aircraft experienced mechanical difficulties of unknown origin. The phrase would haunt Margaret for decades, appearing in every subsequent military document related to her husband's case. No evidence existed of mechanical problems with Best's aircraft, which had undergone complete maintenance inspection just days before the mission. The Dauntless was known for its mechanical reliability, and Best himself was considered one of the squadron's most skilled pilots. The explanation satisfied no one, least of all the woman who had lived with Richard Best for 4 years and knew his meticulous attention to aircraft maintenance. Margaret's efforts to gather more information led her into the labyrinthine world of military record-keeping. She wrote letters to the Bureau of Naval Personnel, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and eventually to her congressman, Representative Bob Wilson of California. Each agency responded with form letters that acknowledged her concerns while providing no substantive information. The phrases became familiar through repetition, classified for reasons of national security. under ongoing investigation and subject to review pending availability of additional information. The most frustrating aspect of Margaret's search was the military's insistence that Lieutenant Best's case remained under active investigation. Navy officials assured her that experienced investigators were examining all available evidence and that new developments could emerge at any time. These assurances, delivered with apparent sincerity, gave Margaret reason to hope while ensuring that she would never receive the definitive answers that might have allowed her to move forward with her life. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The reality, revealed only through declassified documents released decades later, was that the Navy had closed Best's case within 2 months of his disappearance. No ongoing investigation existed, no new evidence was being examined, and no resources were being allocated to finding answers about his fate. The missing in action designation was maintained purely for administrative convenience, allowing the military to avoid the legal and financial obligations that came with declaring someone dead in combat. Margaret Best, along with hundreds of other military families, was kept in bureaucratic limbo, not because the truth was unknown, but because the truth was inconvenient for an institution focused on winning a global war. By the summer of 1942, Margaret Best had transformed from a Navy wife into something far more formidable, an investigator driven by love and desperation. Her small apartment in San Diego had become a makeshift command center, with maps of the Pacific Theater covering one wall and stacks of correspondence with military officials filling every available surface. She had learned to navigate the Byzantine structure of naval bureaucracy, tracking down records clerks, intelligence officers, and maintenance technicians who might have information about her husband's final mission. The breakthrough came in July, when Margaret received a letter from Chief Petty Officer Frank Morrison, a mechanic who had worked on Best's aircraft just days before the fatal mission. Morrison had been transferred to a base in Australia, and his letter took 6 weeks to reach San Diego through the military postal system. His words were carefully chosen, clearly written by someone aware that his correspondence might be subject to censorship, but the message was unmistakable. There had been nothing wrong with Lieutenant Best's Dauntless. Morrison described the pre-flight inspection he had conducted on aircraft 2B3 on February 12th, just 3 days before Best's disappearance. Every system had been functioning perfectly, with recent maintenance records showing no significant problems with engines, radio equipment, or flight controls. The mechanic had personally tested the aircraft's communication systems and had found them operating within normal parameters. His letter concluded with a statement that would become crucial to Margaret's understanding of her husband's fate. "Ma'am, that airplane was as ready to fly as any I've ever worked on. If something happened to Lieutenant Best, it wasn't because his plane let him down." Armed with this information, Margaret began to question the official narrative of mechanical failure that the Navy had consistently promoted. She requested copies of the maintenance logs for Best's aircraft, only to be told that such records were classified for reasons of operational security. Her congressman's office was informed that release of maintenance documents might compromise ongoing military operations in the Pacific, even though the specific aircraft in question had been lost 6 months earlier. The pattern of official stonewalling was becoming clear, but Margaret's determination only grew stronger. The personal cost of her investigation was enormous. Margaret had taken a job at a defense plant to support herself and Tommy, working 10-hour shifts manufacturing aircraft parts while spending her evenings writing letters and making telephone calls to military offices. She had no social life, no romantic relationships, and no interests beyond finding out what had happened to her husband. Friends and family members urged her to move forward with her life, to accept that Richard was gone and focus on raising their son. Margaret's response was always the same. She couldn't grieve properly until she knew the truth. Tommy Best was growing up in the shadow of his father's disappearance, a bright child who understood that his mother was sad but couldn't comprehend the reasons why. Margaret had filled their home with photographs of Richard, creating a shrine to a man that Tommy barely remembered. The boy's earliest memories were of his mother crying while reading letters from the Navy Department and of visiting relatives who spoke in whispers about his father's fate. It was a childhood defined by absence, by questions that couldn't be answered, and by the knowledge that something terrible had happened that the adults couldn't explain. The first anniversary of Richard Best's disappearance passed without any acknowledgement from the military. Margaret had expected some form of official recognition, perhaps a ceremony or a letter from Best's commanding officer, but none came. The Navy had moved on, focused on current operations rather than memorializing the dead. For Margaret, however, February 15, 1943, marked the beginning of her second year of investigation, her second year of unanswered letters, and her second year of living in the limbo between hope and despair. The war ended in August 1945, but for Margaret Best, peace brought no relief. The massive demobilization of American forces created new opportunities for information gathering, as thousands of servicemen returned home with first-hand knowledge of Pacific theater operations. Margaret began attending veteran reunions and Navy Association meetings, hoping to find someone who had served with her husband or had information about his final mission. These gatherings were often painful affairs, where she was surrounded by families celebrating their loved one's safe return while she remained trapped in uncertainty. Her persistence began to pay off in small ways. At a VB-6 squadron reunion in San Francisco, she met Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, who had been Best's flight leader during several missions in early 1942. Patterson had been shot down himself just weeks after Best's disappearance and had spent 3 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. His memories of Best were vivid and contradicted several elements of the official account of the final mission. Patterson revealed that Best had been carrying classified photographic equipment on his February 15th mission, not the standard reconnaissance cameras mentioned in the official reports. The equipment, designated as experimental intelligence gathering apparatus, was being tested for potential use in mapping Japanese fortifications throughout the Pacific. Only 3 pilots in the squadron had been trusted with the classified equipment, and Best had been selected because of his exceptional skill in low-level flying and his proven reliability in sensitive operations. This revelation transformed Margaret's understanding of her husband's disappearance. If Best had been carrying experimental equipment, his mission would have been subject to higher levels of security classification and operational oversight. The mechanical failure explanation began to seem even more suspicious, particularly given the military's obvious reluctance to discuss any details of the mission. Patterson suggested that Best might have encountered Japanese forces while conducting low-level photography, leading to his death in circumstances that the Navy preferred to keep classified. More disturbing was Patterson's account of the squadron's reaction to Best's disappearance. According to Patterson, several pilots had questioned the official explanation of mechanical failure, particularly given Best's reputation for meticulous aircraft maintenance and exceptional flying skill. These concerns had been raised with squadron leadership, but no formal investigation had been conducted. The pilots were told that discussing Best's mission was forbidden for reasons of national security, and several men had been transferred to other units after asking too many questions. The pattern of official secrecy extended far beyond Best's individual case. Patterson described a systematic effort by military intelligence to suppress information about failed missions, missing aircraft, and classified operations that had gone wrong. Families were given minimal information about their loved ones' deaths, not out of cruelty, but because the truth about many Pacific theater operations remained classified for reasons that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with institutional embarrassment. Margaret's investigation took on new urgency as she realized that her husband might have been involved in operations that the military had no intention of ever acknowledging publicly. The missing in action designation wasn't just administrative convenience, it was a deliberate strategy to avoid questions about classified missions that had resulted in unnecessary deaths. Richard Best had become a victim not just of war, but of the institutional secrecy that surrounded America's intelligence-gathering operations in the Pacific. As the 1940s came to a close, Margaret Best had assembled a fragmented but compelling picture of her husband's final mission. He had been carrying experimental equipment, flying in an area known for Japanese air activity, and operating under levels of classification that made official acknowledgement of his death problematic for military leadership. The mechanical failure explanation was almost certainly false, designed to deflect attention from operational details that the Navy preferred to keep secret. But proving these suspicions would require evidence that seemed to be permanently beyond her reach. The 1950s brought a different kind of torment for Margaret Best, the slow realization that her quest for answers might never end. Tommy had grown into a teenager who barely remembered his father, and Margaret herself was approaching 40, her youth consumed by an investigation that seemed to lead nowhere. She had exhausted official channels, interviewed dozens of veterans, and accumulated thousands of pages of correspondence with military bureaucrats. The truth about Richard Best's fate remained as elusive as ever. Margaret's obsession had cost her dearly. She had never remarried, despite several opportunities for companionship with men who understood her loss. Her entire identity had become wrapped up in her role as the widow searching for answers, and she found it impossible to imagine a life that didn't revolve around solving the mystery of her husband's disappearance. Friends had drifted away, exhausted by her single-minded focus on a tragedy that had occurred over a decade earlier. Even Tommy, now 16, had begun to resent his mother's inability to move forward. The breaking point came in 1957, when Margaret received a form letter from the Department of Defense, informing her that Lieutenant Richard Best had been officially declared dead, effective 15 years after his disappearance. The letter, signed by a clerk she had never heard of, explained that the missing in action status had been reviewed and that sufficient time had passed to make a legal determination of death. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of Richard's service, and no explanation of what had happened to him on that February morning over Iwo Jima. Margaret's reaction was explosive. She wrote angry letters to every official who had corresponded with her over the years, demanding to know why she was being notified of her husband's death through routine paperwork rather than through a personal meeting with someone who could answer her questions. The responses were predictably bureaucratic. The determination of death was a legal necessity, not a reflection of new evidence about Best's fate. The military's position remained unchanged. Lieutenant Best had died in an aircraft accident of unknown origin, and no further information was available. If this case has already captivated you, leave a like. This helps Lieutenant Richard Best's story reach more people. The declaration of death did have one positive effect. It forced Margaret to begin the psychological process of grieving that she had postponed for 15 years. She held a memorial service for Richard at the San Diego Naval Base, attended by a handful of surviving squadron members and a Navy chaplain who had never met her husband. The ceremony was simple and dignified, but it felt hollow to Margaret, who still had no idea where Richard was buried or how he had died. Tommy Best graduated from high school that same year and enlisted in the Air Force, drawn to aviation by the same calling that had shaped his father's life. His decision devastated Margaret, who feared losing her son to the same military system that had taken her husband, and then spent 15 years lying to her about his fate. Tommy's response was gentle but firm. He needed to understand his father's world, and military service was the only way he could make that connection. The 1960s passed quietly for Margaret, who had settled into a routine of working at the defense plant and spending her evenings reading about World War II aviation history. She had become an expert on Pacific theater operations, able to discuss the technical specifications of dive bombers and the tactical requirements of reconnaissance missions with remarkable sophistication. Her knowledge was impressive, but it had come at the cost of a normal life, and she was beginning to understand that she might never learn the truth about Richard's fate. By 1970, nearly 30 years after her husband's disappearance, Margaret Best had become a fixture at military history conferences and veteran reunions throughout California. Younger historians sought her out for her encyclopedic knowledge of naval aviation, unaware that her expertise had been born from tragedy rather than academic interest. She had become a living repository of information about men who had died in classified circumstances, their stories preserved only in the memories of widows who had never stopped asking questions. The 1980s brought unexpected developments to Margaret Best's decades-long investigation. Tommy Best, now a retired Air Force colonel with extensive experience in military intelligence, had begun conducting his own research into his father's disappearance. His approach was more systematic than his mother's emotional crusade had been, utilizing his security clearance and military connections to access documents that had been beyond Margaret's reach for 40 years. Tommy's investigation revealed the extent to which his father's case had been deliberately obscured by military bureaucracy. The experimental photographic equipment that Lieutenant Best had been carrying was part of a classified program called Operation Snapshot, designed to gather intelligence about Japanese fortifications in advance of planned amphibious assaults. The program had been compromised by Japanese intelligence services, leading to the loss of several aircraft and the deaths of multiple air crews. Rather than acknowledge the security breach, military leadership had classified the entire operation and attributed all losses to mechanical failures or operational accidents. The revelation was both vindicating and heartbreaking for Margaret, who was now 70 years old and in declining health. She had been right to question the official explanation of her husband's death, but the truth had been hidden so effectively that it had taken 40 years and her son's military career to uncover it. The mechanical failure story had been a deliberate lie, designed to protect military officials who had failed to adequately secure classified operations against enemy infiltration. More disturbing was Tommy's discovery that several other families had been given identical explanations for their loved ones' deaths. The phrase, "mechanical difficulties of unknown origin," appeared in casualty notifications for at least 12 other air crews who had participated in Operation Snapshot. The families had been kept separate from each other, preventing them from comparing their experiences and recognizing the pattern of deception. Margaret Best had spent 40 years believing that her husband's case was unique, when in reality it was part of a systematic cover-up involving dozens of casualties. Tommy's research also revealed the approximate location where his father had died. Intelligence reports declassified in the 1970s showed that Japanese forces had been expecting American reconnaissance aircraft over Iwo Jima on February 15, 1942, suggesting that they had advanced knowledge of Operation Snapshot's activities. Lieutenant Best's Dauntless had likely been shot down by fighters that were positioned specifically to intercept the classified mission. His death had not been the result of mechanical failure or operational accident, but of a security breach that military leadership had covered up to avoid accountability. The discovery of classified documents related to Operation Snapshot opened new avenues of investigation, but it also revealed the limitations of what could be learned through official channels. The most sensitive aspects of the operation remained classified, including specific details about how Japanese intelligence had compromised the mission and whether American officials had suspected the security breach before sending air crews into known danger. Tommy Best had enough security clearance to access some restricted documents, but not enough to see the complete picture of his father's final mission. Margaret's reaction to these revelations was complex. She felt vindicated by the proof that her suspicions had been correct, but also betrayed by the realization that she had wasted 40 years pursuing answers that were available in classified archives all along. The military officials who had corresponded with her over the decades had known the truth about Richard's death, but had chosen to maintain the fiction of mechanical failure rather than acknowledge the operational failures that had led to his death. The personal cost of this deception was immense. Margaret had never remarried because she couldn't move forward without knowing what had happened to Richard. She had sacrificed her emotional well-being, her social relationships, and her psychological health in pursuit of answers that could have been provided at any time if military officials had chosen honesty over institutional protection. The cover-up had claimed two victims, Lieutenant Richard Best, who died in combat, and Margaret Best, who spent 40 years dying slowly from unanswered questions. In the spring of 2024, marine archaeologist Dr. Sarah Chen received funding for an ambitious project, mapping the seafloor around Iwo Jima, using advanced sonar technology developed for deep ocean exploration. The project was part of a broader effort to document World War II-era shipwrecks in the Pacific, providing historical closure for families while advancing scientific understanding of underwater preservation. Dr. Chen had no idea that her research would finally solve one of the Pacific Theater's longest-standing mysteries. The breakthrough came on March 15, 2025, exactly 83 years and 1 month after Lieutenant Richard Best's disappearance. Dr. Chen's research vessel was conducting a systematic survey of the waters north of Iwo Jima when sonar operators detected an anomalous signature on the ocean floor, approximately 2 miles from the island's northern beaches. The object was clearly artificial, with dimensions consistent with a World War II-era aircraft, lying at a depth of 340 feet in an area that had never been previously surveyed. The initial dive to investigate the anomaly was conducted using a remotely operated vehicle equipped with high-definition cameras and sample collection equipment. What Dr. Chen and her team found on their monitors was both heartbreaking and historically significant: the largely intact wreckage of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber, its tail number clearly visible despite 8 decades of submersion. The aircraft was 2B3, Lieutenant Richard Best's plane, resting on a sandy bottom with its cockpit canopy still partially intact. The discovery location provided crucial information about Best's final moments. The aircraft had crashed approximately 5 miles north of its planned reconnaissance route, in an area known to have been heavily patrolled by Japanese fighters in early 1942. The wreckage showed clear evidence of combat damage, with bullet holes in the fuselage and wing structures that contradicted 40 years of official claims about mechanical failure. Lieutenant Best had not died in an accident. He had been shot down while conducting classified reconnaissance operations. More importantly, the crash site yielded human remains and personal effects that could finally provide closure for Best's family. Dr. Chen's team recovered Lieutenant Best's flight jacket, his personal effects, and most significantly his flight log, which had been preserved in a waterproof case inside the cockpit. The log's final entries described encountering Japanese fighter aircraft while conducting low-level photography of beach fortifications, confirming that Best had died in combat rather than from equipment failure. The flight log also contained information that would have been invaluable to military historians if it had been recovered in 1942. Best had documented Japanese defensive positions, aircraft types, and tactical procedures that could have informed subsequent American operations. His death had not only been a personal tragedy for his family, but a significant intelligence loss that had been compounded by the military's decision to classify the entire mission and pretend that it had never occurred. Dr. Chen immediately contacted the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the military organization responsible for recovering and identifying American servicemen who had died in overseas conflicts. The agency had been searching for Lieutenant Best's remains for decades, but had never had access to the classified information that would have directed them to the correct search area. The cover-up that had tormented Margaret Best for 40 years had also prevented military investigators from conducting an effective search for her husband's remains. The discovery of aircraft 2B3 also yielded evidence of Radioman First Class James Murray, Best's rear gunner, whose own family had endured decades of uncertainty about his fate. Murray's remains were found at his duty station, suggesting that he had continued to operate the aircraft's defensive armament until the moment of impact. Both men had died doing their duty, but their families had been denied the truth about their sacrifice for reasons that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with institutional embarrassment. News of the discovery reached Tommy Best through official military channels in April 2025. His mother Margaret had died in 2003, 22 years before the truth about her husband's fate was finally revealed. She had spent 61 years not knowing where Richard was buried, what had happened to him, or why military officials had lied to her for so long. The discovery came too late to provide her with the closure she had sought her entire adult life. The recovery of Lieutenant Richard Best's remains in the summer of 2025 triggered a comprehensive review of Operation Snapshot and the military's handling of classified mission casualties during World War II. Defense Department historians, working with newly declassified documents, began to piece together the full scope of the cover-up that had kept Best's family in the dark for over 8 decades. What they found was a pattern of institutional deception that had affected hundreds of military families throughout the Pacific Theater. The review revealed that Operation Snapshot had been compromised from its inception, with Japanese intelligence services apparently having access to detailed information about American reconnaissance missions around Iwo Jima. Military leadership had suspected the security breach as early as January 1942, but had continued to authorize classified missions while conducting an internal investigation into the intelligence leak. Lieutenant Best and at least 11 other aircrews had been sent into known danger while their commanders debated how to address the compromise of their operations. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the security breach had been traced to a Japanese spy ring operating within the Hawaiian intelligence community by March 1942, just 1 month after Best's death. The information that could have prevented subsequent losses was available, but military officials had chosen to continue the compromised operations rather than acknowledge the intelligence failure. The cover-up had been designed not to protect national security, but to protect the careers of officers who had failed in their duty to safeguard classified information. Tommy Best, now 79 years old, attended the military ceremony honoring his father's sacrifice at Arlington National Cemetery in September 2025. The service was attended by Defense Secretary Robert Hamilton, who delivered a formal apology for the military's decades-long deception regarding Best's death and the deaths of other Operation Snapshot casualties. The apology was comprehensive, acknowledging both the operational failures that had led to Best's death and the institutional dishonesty that had compounded his family's suffering. The ceremony was emotionally devastating for Tommy, who had spent his entire life wondering about his father's fate, while his mother slowly died from unanswered questions. He had been denied the opportunity to know his father, while his mother had been denied the opportunity to grieve properly and move forward with her life. The military's apology was sincere and necessary, but it could not restore the decades that had been lost to official deception and bureaucratic cruelty. The investigation into Operation Snapshot also revealed the broader context of Best's sacrifice. His reconnaissance photography, recovered from the wreckage of aircraft 2B3, had provided detailed intelligence about Japanese fortifications on Iwo Jima that proved accurate when American forces finally assaulted the island in 1945. Best had died gathering information that contributed to the eventual Allied victory, but his contribution had been hidden along with the circumstances of his death. He was a war hero whose heroism had been classified for 83 years. Dr. Sarah Chen's archaeological discovery had provided more than just closure for Lieutenant Best's family. It had exposed a systematic pattern of military dishonesty that had affected countless American families during and after World War II. The Defense Department's review identified at least 347 cases where families had been given false explanations for their loved ones' deaths to protect classified operations or cover up military failures. The institutional scope of the deception was staggering, representing one of the largest peacetime cover-ups in American military history. The recovery of Best's remains also provided an opportunity for scientific analysis that confirmed the combat circumstances of his death. Forensic examination of the aircraft wreckage showed that the Dauntless had been hit by at least 12 rounds of cannon fire from Japanese fighter aircraft, causing catastrophic damage to the engine and flight controls. Best had likely remained conscious and in control of his aircraft until the moment of water impact, demonstrating the courage and skill that had made him one of the Navy's most trusted pilots. The final irony of Lieutenant Richard Best's story was that his death had been preventable. The intelligence failures that led to Operation Snapshot's compromise were known to military leadership, but institutional pride and career concerns had prevented officials from acknowledging their mistakes and protecting the air crews under their command. Best had died not because his mission was necessary, but because his commanders lacked the moral courage to admit their failures and cancel operations that had been compromised by enemy intelligence. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Lieutenant Richard Best's story. We'll see you in the next video.